All right, let's continue talking about Project 45. We have many, many problems in the country right now and in the world, fairly similar problems. But we're also all experiencing divided governments almost everywhere. And so if a government is mostly caught up with trying to beat the other side or trying to remain in power, then they don't really have the time and the energy to really solve some of the problems that everybody is experiencing. And you only have to look around you to see some of the problems. So I think for young people, obviously they have a huge economic problem. Many of them who have been to college have these huge college debts that they're going to have to pay. We've got a huge percentage of young people still living with their parents all through their 20s and even 30s. So nobody really wants to do that. But if you're very disempowered by what's happened to you in your life, then you have no choice. So all of us, I think, are experiencing a certain amount of being disempowered. But when I say all, let's say all but a very small number. And that is because a very small number of people have the vast majority of the wealth in this country. And that is becoming a worldwide problem. So it's not only the distribution of wealth that is a big part of the problem, but there are consequences of some of the ways that that has been affected, that's happened, such as the pollution, such as the climate crisis that we're all experiencing. A lot of these are due to some of the decisions that have been made over the last few decades, and maybe a little bit longer than that even. So we can't solve these until we see the roots. Why is it like this? And it's easy to see that the distribution of wealth is due to a large extent to people's selfishness and total focus on profit. It's not completely that. There's a lot, and then there's also a lot of different ways that has happened, that people have been able to focus on profit. Just we have not been able to deal well with the digital era, right? Every time we have a new technology, then it takes a while before we get used to it, before we know how to use it to empower everybody. And actually, that usually isn't the goal. It may be the goal of the people who feels left out and left behind. But unfortunately, history teaches us that the goal of people is way too much just to focus on becoming wealthy themselves. So we need to have a government that can manage this. We need to have some sort of controls and some oversight as to what is happening. We can't just leave companies to become monopolies and to give all of the profits to their shareholders or pay themselves these huge amounts of compensation of wages, although it's usually in the form of stocks and shares and so on. We can't just sort of sit back and let that happen, because we are experiencing the consequences of that. And I wouldn't say it's totally one side or the other. I wouldn't say it's totally Republicans. It's definitely not totally Democrats, but it's a way of thinking, right? And there's plenty of Democrats who think that way too. So we have to decide what we want to see. We need to decide on a reasonable distribution. Right now, because there's so many people who have essentially nothing, then we're experiencing huge, massive addictions. So many people are addicted to something or other. Because people have no vision for the future. Even if everything was great, even if things were distributed pretty evenly, then the idea that you've just got to spend, the next, say, 40 years of your life just working for a company is just not all that inspiring. What about if you want to run around the world and climb mountains and help people and just travel? There's just so much more to life than working, getting a paycheck, and saving for your retirement. So what about the people who don't want to do that, actually? Who would like to study and research and be creative and paint and write? What about the people who want to raise children? There's so many things that life is about that are really restricted if you don't have any money. I'm sure that a lot of women would actually really like to be able to stay home with their children when they're very young. But of course they don't want to be forced to, which seems to be a program in some people's mind right now, to try to sort of bring back the good old days. But the good old days are going to stay in the past. But still, actually, many women do want to stay home with their children. So we have to think of how we can make that happen. Should we pay them a wage when they stay home? Should child raising be paid? Should taking care of the house be paid? Right? We have to think about that. And there's arguments both for that and against that. So what we're going to do is we're going to hear the arguments both for and against pretty much everything, all the different things that we're going to look into. But we can't hear them necessarily from the same person, because when you talk, you almost inevitably present things from your perspective. It's just hard not to. So as far as I'm doing any presenting, then you'll obviously pick up on what I think. But I will do my best. But I think overall, we have to hear from the people who have certain values why they think like that. Why did they come to the conclusion that we shouldn't all have access to abortion, right? We need to hear both sides of that. All sides is way more than two sides, almost always. So it's clearly there's a great deal of hopelessness. We have to be able to solve some of that. We can't go into the future with a huge percentage of the population just completely devastated. We can't go into the future if we're destroying the planet. Indigenous communities used to live on the planet, the same place, for tens of thousands of years. And they left the land in the same condition as they found it. They lived on the land in a harmonious way, and they loved the land. But we tend to think of the land as though it's a commodity. The model in our society is that land is a commodity. In other words, it exists for us, for our economic benefit to use to make money. But the land is so much more than that. We need some measure of re-enchantment of our land and nature and ourselves, who we are. We need to have a different vision of who we are. Because right now we think of people as commodities. So we have to go beyond that, and we have to have a greater vision of what is a human, and we have to be able to understand all of our points of view and together reach some kind of agreement.